Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and get started. If you are viewing this video, it most likely means that you are home or outside of our class. This is our first attempt to do a flipped classroom. So just as a reminder, during this time, you are taking notes over the lecture, and you're gonna use those notes and bring those notes to class on Wednesday. And hopefully we can get started with class right away without having to do this portion. So to get going, today we're on notes number 29, natural selection. Last class, we talked a little bit about the four factors that drive evolution. So we're talking about overproduction, variation, competition, and inheritance. But today we're going to actually talk about not the factors that drive evolution, but evolution itself through a process called natural selection. So just like I said, today our topic is natural selection. This is the actual mechanism in which evolution occurs. And in this photo, we see that natural selection can happen in three places. Last time we talked about the four factors. These four factors must be present in order for natural selection to occur. So in this case, obviously there needs to be an overpopulation in frame one of mice. Once there's overpopulation, there are variations, right? There are differences in the mice. Some are gray and some are white. In the second frame, we see the third factor that must be present is competition. And the competition is between the mice, who can survive, right? And in this case, because the white mice stand out from the gray backdrop, the eagle is going to easily come and swoop the mice and thereby killing it. So the more advantageous trait in this case would be the gray mice, because the advantageous trait is the trait that helps it survive. In this case, because they are able to camouflage in with their surroundings, they can then survive. Over millions and millions of years, we finally get kind of the fourth factor of evolution, and that is inheritance. And in this case, the gray mice will then live long enough to reproduce, while the white mice will slowly die off because they will not live long enough to reproduce. This whole idea that I just explained is natural selection, and we're going to get more into the specifics of it during this lecture. So evolution, as you guys know, is the genetic change of a population over time. It's usually millions of years, right? It's not just one individual. Evolution happens to a population of species. Evolution, just to be clear, it's not fact, right? It's not factual. It's not like the sky is blue. We think of evolution as a theory, a well-supported theory, right? There are other ways that we can explain evolution, but it's just a theory, but it's very well supported. In this case, we have the theory of whale evolution. We said that whales were once four-legged land mammals, and over time, due to evolution, they have been able to survive and go back into the water and be water animals, but there are a lot of structures inside whales that can prove to us through the different evidences of evolution that they used to be four-legged mammals. So we start our conversation with this guy, Charles Darwin, and we talked a little bit about him last time, but he's essentially the guy who coined the term natural selection. His idea, right, he believed that all organisms, even of the same species, were all different. So look at the human population, right? We're all one species, but we're all different. We're all kind of unique. There's little things about us. We all have heads, shoulders, knees, toes, etc., but we're still different in those ways, and that's what he believed. He called them variations. You will learn this word in last class, but essentially it just means that even within the same species, there are animals that look different. And with those differences, he believed that some of those differences helped animals survive in their environments, and some of those differences did not help them survive. He believed that those who survived passed their genes on to future generations, while those with differences that didn't help them survive died before they could pass their genes on. So this is a little bit of the same idea that we learned about last class. A little more about his idea on natural variation. He said that obviously there are differences, just like we talked about. These differences provide unique advantages and disadvantages, right? So these differences in a population, some of those differences will be good and some of them will be bad, but it all depended on the environment. It's important because the advantages or disadvantages in an individual can change depending on which environment they're in. If you're in a snowy environment, having white fur is probably more advantageous than having tan fur. But if you move those same animals to a desert, the advantageous trait will switch. The tan will become more advantageous or favorable than the white fur. So just really depends on the environment that the animal lives in. And last but not least, obviously, depending on what environment it is, individuals with traits that help them in that environment will survive, and those that do not will not live long enough to reproduce. Can't get that point across enough. And the basis that we see all this in is just this idea of a gene pool, right? The gene pool is essentially just, it's not actually a pool, but it is the set of all genes that are possible within a population. So example again, we have the white rabbit and the tan rabbit. If we live in a snowy population, we have both types. If a certain gene is not fit to survive, it will gradually disappear from the gene pool. So if these two types of rabbits, the white and the tan one, lived in a snowy environment, the white one is obviously going to survive or be more likely to survive because its skin is able to camouflage in with its surroundings. The tan color rabbit, however, that gene will eventually disappear from the gene pool because those tan bunnies are probably not going to live long enough eventually to pass it down. And slowly, millions of years later, we might only see white fur inside the gene pool. So that's what we mean by gene pool. Things that impact the gene pool obviously are mutations, right? Mutations causes these differences in all the animals. The more mutations we have, the more variation or differences we have in this gene pool. We like to be really clear that environmental conditions do not cause those mutations, right? Just because you live in the white snowy environment doesn't mean that your body will eventually just miraculously mutate into white skin, right? We get the white and the tan skins based on random mutations. So this brings us all together into Darwin's theory of natural selection. Natural selection is the process by which organisms best suited for their environment will survive and reproduce. Everything that we just talked about and everything last class, this all leads to this grand idea of natural selection. Essentially, it's called natural selection because nature, or the environment, essentially selects which members of a species will survive and which ones will die, right? The environment, nature, the snowy environment. This environment is the one that chooses whether white fur will survive or tan fur will survive. It has nothing to do with the animals themselves, but rather what environment they are in. If the environment changes, just like we talked about earlier, so do the species that live there, right? We have a snowy environment, we have the white bunnies and the brown bunnies, and over time, right, we start to see that white bunnies are surviving more than brown bunnies, but then all of a sudden a drastic change happens and the once snowy environment turns into a desert. Well, we're going to start to see that the species in that environment is going to change. Even though it was used to be predominantly white, we're going to see in like millions of years we might only find brown bunnies or like tan bunnies in that same region. So just understanding that the environment is ultimately the selector, the selection process. It's not the individual itself. Unfortunately, the animals have no say. It just really depends on what their environment requires them to have in order to survive. Natural selection acts on phenotypes, right? It acts on what the animal looks like themselves. It doesn't enact on their genes, like natural selection doesn't care whether you're dominant or you're recessive or you're heterozygous or homozygous, right? It just really cares about like what you look like on the outside. So phenotypes is what natural selection uses in order to determine who survives and who dies. Competition, also key thing, just like environment doesn't cause mutations, competition doesn't cause mutations, right? Just because I want to reach higher leaves in the trees, I'm not going to grow a longer neck just to be able to reach those higher leaves in the trees. Mutations are random. And last but not least, right, we talk about depending on what type of mutations you get, if that mutation is going to help you survive in that environment, then that mutation will get passed on to future generations. If you get a mutation that's not really going to help you survive in your environment and in fact hurts you, you're not going to live long enough to have offspring, and therefore we don't really have to worry about that mutation. But mutations essentially lead to change, and they can be good, bad, or they can really have no effect. So to kind of sum up natural selection, to be really cutthroat, natural selection is the process of elimination, right? Nature is going to select who lives and who dies, and there's really nothing you can do about it because your traits are completely random. Individuals that have traits that are best adapted for their current environment are the ones that survive. Those who do not possess those traits that help them survive die or don't live long enough to pass on their genes to offspring. Natural selection is what we call the survival of the fittest. Remember though that fitness does not mean big or strong, it just means fitness is how well do you fit the environment that you live in. Do your traits help you survive in whatever particular environment that you live in? And I want to leave you guys with this quote before we end this lecture. It is not the strongest of the species that survive, nor the most intelligent, but the most responsive to change. So, given a set of traits, if your environment changes, if your traits are able to help you survive in multiple environments, you're the one who is going to live the longest and pass your genes on. That's essentially how evolution works. We see that there is obviously a status quo, like all animals are saying we have white bunnies and tan bunnies, but over time, the environment is snowy, it helps the white bunnies survive, the tan ones die off, and we see more white bunnies than tan bunnies. All of a sudden, pretend a drought happens, and that once snowy environment turns into a desert. You're now going to start to see that these tan bunnies are able to survive because they probably have thinner coats, they're tan, they can blend in with their background. And they're going to see that over millions of years, this area where you used to have a ton of white bunnies and only little brown bunnies, your population sizes are going to change. You're going to have more and more tan bunnies and less white bunnies. So just depends on who is most responsive to change. It doesn't matter if the tan bunnies are like the size of a penny and the white bunnies are the size of a chair. You know, it's not the strongest or the biggest that survive, but the one most likely to fit the environment it lives in.